Hi, and welcome so much. Welcome to a conversation today with a fantastic author about a book that is going to be useful to hopefully you, but definitely we know to young people as they're thinking about the future and how things are happening and where they should go and what they should do. So I'm really delighted to bring on a friend of mine and soon to be yours, Dr. Michelle Weise, who is the entrepreneur in residence and senior advisor at Imaginable Futures. But many of you are familiar with Dr. Weise, who has been on our one of our live streams before. We've had conversations before. She's previously served as the Chief Innovation Officer at both Strata Education Network and Southern New Hampshire University. So for those of you who are in the higher ed innovation space, those are definitely important places to think about. And obviously she's played an important part in the higher ed space. So welcome, Dr. Weise. We're excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Bridget, for having me.
So we're here to talk about your new book that just came out like a few days before Thanksgiving. I don't have a copy, so I can create a copy.
I think I should just keep it right next to my face the whole time.
Oh, no, perfect. And I'll put on my glasses because this is a book talk, so I look smart. So what we're going to talk about. So the title of the book is Long Life Learning: Preparing for the jobs that don't even exist yet. And so, can you give a little bit of background for our viewers about what made you? When you started writing this book, it was obviously pre-COVID, I assume, unless you're like the most productive person in the world and then, had to. But what made you start thinking about this and why this particular framing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously a play on words when we're talking about long life learning as opposed to lifelong learning. And it's deliberate in the sense that like many of you who have been in higher ed or in this kind of workforce space, we're always hearing about lifelong learning. And I think we all just intuitively grasp the concept and know that we're going to have to retool ourselves over a lifetime. But the reason why I wrote this was really just, I wasn't seeing any of the investment theses change across funders. I wasn't sort of seeing a lot of investment in the infrastructure and the architecture and the different kinds of systems that would need to exist to really help us all as job seekers navigate this really uncertain world of work ahead. And so that's what really sort of inspired the sort of first iteration of this book. But yes, it was written pre-COVID. And so it did require some sort of shifting of thought once COVID hit.
What kinds of shifts do you think would you make right now if you were starting the book again? Anything that you would shift or tweak about the framing or the initial approach that you took?
Yeah, so the initial mental model was just that if we just think about an expanded work life or an extended work life, because there were a lot of different futurists and prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of just trendy conversations about the future of work, and people were thinking about automation and AI and thinking about jobs that we would lose to computerization. So there was this focus on this uncertain world of work ahead. And the idea was, okay, if we have a longer work life, a longer life, because there were a lot of, experts on aging and longevity, proposing that we might actually live longer lives, and you just extend that work life just a little bit, because even now today, people are staying in the workforce for way longer than they ever expected. How is that 2-year degree or that 4-year degree or that high school diploma actually going to help you sustain, a comfortable lifestyle over that slightly extended work life, or maybe even dramatically extended work life? And so that was kind of the original concept of, okay, like when we think about this new mental model of a longer life, it kind of throws into sharp relief all the changes that we need to think about, because we don't have a lot of on and off ramps in and out of learning and work. And then when COVID hit, it really just kind of brought to the fore all the work that we maybe thought we had 5 or 10 years to fix. It made clear that everything was sort of in shambles, prior to that moment, and we had to fix it now. And so, even before you had, 40 million unemployment claims, there were over 40 million working class Americans who were really struggling to thrive in the labor market. And so that just, everything just kind of was exposed all at once. And so that urgency just became so real when the pandemic hit. So it's it's not that I actually, had to rewrite the book. It was more just to kind of contextualize that all of these cracks in the system were there, and isolate what those cracks were, and to show that it's not just something we can kind of hold off for another 5 or 10 years. It's actually right now that we have to fix some of the stuff.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions for you, but I think the most natural space is to pick up on the cracks in the system. Mm-hmm. What cracks do you see are most urgent for institutions to address in this moment, or would you say are at the front of the list?
Yeah, so prior to the moment that the global pandemic hit, we, if we're thinking about just institutions of higher ed, because I know that is a huge portion of your audience, Bridget, a lot of the indicators were actually showing us that the traditional models weren't necessarily going to be sustainable for the future, right? There were already just kind of some projections of mergers and closures that might take place in the future. Highly tuition dependent schools, independent schools might have trouble filling seats. And we have to remember that really over the course of a century, almost, we've expanded the number of institutions of higher ed in the US from something like 1900 in the 40s to over 4,700 at one point, right? And that means you have to actually fill those seats through enrollment. And our traditional learner population of 18 to 24-year-olds is really projected to kind of plateau. It's already been plateauing, and in the mid 2030s, it's just really going to drop off a cliff. And so the natural thing to do as a university is to think about where those other consumers of education might be, those people who might be seeking more education. And the prime example was in adult learners, but we didn't necessarily see universities just kind of switching gears and figuring out how to meet those adult learners where they are. And so the book really is focused on these folks who are being left behind, who can't fit into this much more rigid and linear system that doesn't really have a lot of flexibility and convenience embedded into it, and think about who those learners are. And I surface a lot of their voices through the qualitative interviews we did at Strada Institute for the Future of Work. And we surface these voices of the folks who are really in that bottom quartile of the labor market, who are telling us that we really need better career navigation and sort of skills compasses, ways to analyze our skills gaps. We need better wraparound support services, those 360-degree support services that help people stay accountable. We need more precise educational pathways. It's not always going to be a degree that people are seeking, and it has to be integrated. It can't always be something on top of work or something that requires all that. It's already on the burden already rests on the individual. How do we make this it's more hands-on, experiential, and work-based, and so that you don't have to forego wages in order to advance your education? And then we just need fair and transparent hiring practices. And so those were sort of the 5 areas as we surfaced a lot of the voices of adult learners. Those were the recurring themes, and so we kind of isolate those and go into the solutions that exist today and how much more we need to see of those in the future.
That's great. And we have some comments already coming in from our listeners. So folks, if you're watching live on any of our channels, if you post a comment or a question, I can actually, I can surface it for Dr. Weise while we're talking with her. So I did want to circle back a little bit and just kind of ground this in the human element. So you have a fairly interesting background. You've been in like the innovation space. You've been in the like a creative space, but all academic and emerging of all kinds of things. When you were younger, what did you think was going to be your long life job or your future role? And I'm just curious about that versus where you ended up now, and how that kind of difference. How did that influence how you looked at this, writing this book?
Yeah, I think, as we think back to what we were thinking about as little kids, I think we had just sort of more concrete or discernible containers of activities, right? Like, I'm Korean, so from my parents, it was, are you going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a businesswoman, right? Those were my 3 options ahead of me. But even if you think about, I want to be a nurse. I want to be a firefighter. These were sort of specific containers that we could articulate and aspire towards. Today, I think what's harder is that so many of the roles that are in demand are hybrid in nature. They may sound a certain way, but it really does mean that you have to have a grasp of different kinds of generalist and specialist skills. And I think what's really, really critical for the future is we think about preparing for this deep, because none of us can actually predict what specific jobs are going to emerge in the future. But if we think about what's happening today, and we think about how wicked these problems are, especially with the emergence of artificial intelligence. If anyone has watched, The Social Dilemma, it is deeply terrifying as you think about the implications of what we have built, right? Technology has kind of outstripped our ability to kind of anticipate what might happen. We haven't thought about these sorts of volume repercussions of what we produce. And now we're scrambling to react and rein it in, right? And so as you think about those skills that we're going to need for the future, it really does require these broad conceptual kind of this ability to understand how we think about problem solving across domains. It's not just, I need to prepare and major in math or major in computer science or get this anthropology degree, because that specific way in which we, maybe think about lenses on the world, we're actually going to have to be so much more nimble and adaptive in the future. And so it's just fascinating to think about, I thought I wanted to be an artist. I thought I wanted to be a teacher at one point, right? Those were the containers that I was thinking about. But even my career trajectory, I started off as an academic, but kind of moved into education technology and, all these different kinds of worlds. You have to constantly upskill or access or acquire some sort of new approach, and you have to be able to synthesize and think about systems thinking. And so the question ahead for our university is how are we being deliberate about thinking about the FAR transfer of skills? This is one of the hardest things for universities to do, is to cultivate learners who really understand what FAR transfer is, taking the skills you learn in one context and learning how to apply it in a totally different domain.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm thinking about my career trajectory in that context, because I was a poli-sci major, and I did at one point lobby on behalf of a lot of universities when I was chief of staff for a university system. And my job today does not really do any of that stuff, I thought. But most of what I do is very similar to the work that I did trying to pass legislation. It's about drawing consensus. It's about, getting, taking a ton of edits and, and getting us over the finish line, making sure everyone's still on board. So I'm thinking about those kind of negotiation skills, those kind of translation skills, the shuttle diplomacy skills. And so perhaps that aligns with what you're talking about. Okay. So
that is huge, Bridget, in terms of I just want to underscore what you're talking about in terms of translation skills, because I think that is, I know you've been obsessed with trying to facilitate this handoff, right, between education and work and making it smoother for learners. And part of that is really being very intentional and deliberate in the translation process. We do not give our job seekers, our graduates, really good language on how to market themselves, but there are very discrete skills they are gaining through their education. And that translation process is so critical. And even between jobs, right? Like the idea of pivoting from one job to another and getting a chance in a totally different industry, you have to be able to make the case for why those skills port from one domain to another. So just all those skills that you've learned in translation and storytelling, they're so critical. But we don't necessarily bring those down to the level of our youngest learners to help them understand how this is really going to benefit them in the future.
Yeah. And we also don't help our faculty take out their curriculum, take a look at it from the perspective of future employment for those students and do that translation. I mean, we're asking faculty to do a million things right now, far more than before, and in very uncomfortable, difficult circumstances. But it's becoming clearer and clearer. And I know this because of our work that our campuses are doing to redesign college to career, which is supported by Strata Education Network. What we're finding is really that, being able to articulate the specific competencies students that are coming out of the classroom and do it in a language that is actually fluent that actually works for employers in the job search process. That's actually something that we haven't done in the past. Our campuses are building that out and are implementing prototypes right now. But it's clearly that the rest of higher ed, it's definitely a space that it's almost like an extra level of professional development that we're going to have to worry about figuring out, because not only are you going to need to learn how to do Zoom U, we got to figure out how to do, something better than just the traditional lecture. And once you're done, how do you help students translate what they learned so that they could use it in an interview? That's a different entire skill set. And it's going to have to change how we do professional development for faculty as well. It's not just for services.
I know. I've been thinking about this a lot, and my fear right now is, like, as we're living in this really strange time when we have to pretty much deploy everything in a remote or hybrid model, is I'm worried that so much of the energy and the resources are going to get channeled toward just kind of transplanting what we were doing in person and into online. I'm seeing this happen in real time with my children as their teachers literally just kind of try to do exactly what they're doing in person, but through Zoom or through Google Hangouts. And the real opportunity here is not to just sort of take your syllabus and think about how to chunk up that syllabus into shorter videos or 8-minute engaging videos. It is really about reimagining this completely. And I'll just throw this out there just because it was totally inspiring over the last week. I talked to a professor in the UK. His name is Carl Gombrich, and he is building a totally new university called the London Interdisciplinary School. And what he is doing is he is bringing interdisciplinary studies and really trying to think about how you take a concept and it's the same idea that the D school at Stanford came up with, like purpose learning, right? Like how do you give learners a problem to solve, a challenge to solve? It's the same idea of the Grand Challenges Scholars Program from the National Academies. But what he's doing is he's taking like one problem statement, and he'll say, he's going to cast a problem statement for his learners, like, how do you measure unhappiness? And so 40% of the curriculum of the semester is going to deal with the concept and, that problem statement, and they're going to learn different kinds of threshold concepts like valence in language and arousal when you're talking about, psychology. And then they're going to spend 60% of the time in methods. And then that's when you start to, transfer it into the different disciplines that you would need to understand in order to, really go deeper into this problem solving. And so it's those kinds of things where I'm hoping, instead of just kind of thinking about a literal translation from in-person to online, is how do we actually move away from our lecture-based models, right? Our content delivery, and think about real problem-based learning. And that's kind of a real crux of this book, because as we think about building this capability within ourselves and within our learners, it is this sense of range and kind of broad base. It's that T-shaped learner, but it's many more sort of jagged edges along the way, because you're going to have to constantly broaden your human skills, but then also tack on these technical skills along the way.
Okay. All right. So now let's get to the real nuts and bolts of why people are tuning in. What advice do you have for current students who are trying to prepare for the future? What do you tell them? Because I know you're going to get asked this question. You're going to get asked what parents should do as well. And I'm hoping that you can give our listeners a little bit perspective. I don't assume that you have major in this, but I have a feeling you have some other resources for them.
Yeah. So because I'm writing about long life learning and sort of the inadequacy of maybe a 4-year degree over a 60, 70, 80-year career, people often ask me, so is a college degree still worth it? And hands down, it is a no-brainer that if you can actually complete a college degree, it is no doubt worth it. A college degree, gets you over, on average, $900,000 over a lifetime than someone with just a high school diploma. So from a financial perspective, yes, it is this kind of no-brainer. The challenge is, how do you make sense of the 4,300 institutions out there? How do you make sense of the over 738,000 credentials out there? And how do you know if you pick this particular learning experience that it will be worth it, right? Like it will prepare you for that future of work. So I think it's really important for learners today, because this is one of the biggest investments of our lives. And it's also one of the biggest black boxes of our lives, because we don't get a lot of transparency about outcomes and about people's regrets or where they land or whether they're happy that they pursued this degree at this school. Because we don't have a lot of that transparency, it's really on learners and their families to evaluate schools and kind of go in as almost like a savvy shopper of higher education, right? Like you have to be able to see, how is it that my school is actually talking about work-based learning and helping me translate my skills into the language of the labor market? How are they talking about picking a major, or do they have a specific approach to thinking about interdisciplinary learning, and how do they articulate that, and how do they show that through the learners that they feature or the graduates that they talk about? Do they publish the outcomes of their students? Do we know, are they able to pay off their debt load? These kinds of things, and it's a very different approach than I think when some of us were going to college, where I think it was still that sort of sense that, well, if I just do this, it's going to be kind of an automatic ticket into the middle class. And that calculus is just not so simple anymore. So I think it's just really on the learner, on the families, unfortunately for now, until we have better data infrastructure and better, outcomes data that are linked and more transparent, for that we have to do this kind of evaluation of, how are they actually talking about the skills I am going to need for the future? Because I think it's in those conversations where you see whether those schools are really connected to emerging jobs, to thinking about the kinds of skills that they're going to need to develop earlier on instead of right before graduation or after graduation, right? It's really just important for learners to see that a university is not saying, oh, well, you don't need to worry about your job because we're preparing you for an entire career where you're going to be able to pivot no matter what you want to do. It has to be that they have some awareness of how difficult it is to launch right now and the kinds of things you need to do in order to get a toehold. And then from there, how do you think about, further developing your skills? So it's a really complicated question today, but I think if we approach it in the same way that we just make a purchase on Amazon, where we want to see what other people have said, we want consumer reviews, we want some outcomes data, we want to know that this thing works. I think that's something to think about.
Okay, so as a parent, what are you doing differently with your children and guiding them that you don't think you would have been doing prior to writing this book?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because my daughter is sort of like a rule follower, and so the synchronous learning works really well for her. My son is one of those kids who is very curious and will go down these rabbit holes of learning things, but doesn't do well with the rigidity of time-based learning. And so it's just fascinating to see, and I think Zoom just sort of exacerbates this, or some sort of online outlet just exacerbates the need to pitch towards the middle, right? And that when you're learning, you have to kind of follow along at sort of that middle rate, and what happens to the laggards or what happens to the folks who are a little bit ahead, you see it happening, it just in real time. So it's hard because, my son, for instance, is in one of those time-based, is in one of those very synchronous things. And I have to be constantly kind of pushing him back to stay part of that flow, even though deep down, like what he's doing in terms of, exploring his passion and his curiosity is the thing I should really be facilitating. But it's this horrible tension where I know what he's doing is actually deeply important. It's what Ken Robinson has talked about in his famous TED Talk, right? But when they're measuring based on time, and they're literally having to measure the number of hours they're engaging with learners online, it's sort of heartbreaking to see this happen in real time, and not really be able to to do a lot.
Well, I think it's very normal, though, in terms of the advice that you give, kind of running counter to what you intuitively know, if you can reflect. I mean, even when I'm giving advice to my little with Big Brothers Big Sisters, I reflected back and I was like, oh, I gave guidance and was very like, you have to go to this kind of school and you have to major in this. And then I was like, you know what? Actually, I started at community college and I just ambled my way around, and I just, like, total dumb luck ended up, and I'm fine. I'm fine. Trying to find things where you can contribute and you can learn something and just be guided by looking for interesting problems. I followed that kind of advice, but for some reason in giving advice, I somehow caught myself falling into the same formulaic advice that I think a lot of parents are forced to give. And that it's because of this belief that there is a right path and there's a wrong path, and we're all being compared. And that is not helpful. And also very hypocritical. I'm just saying it.
No, but I have hope for the future, though, that there are some new kinds of AI-based platforms that are doing a better job of like trying to surface the things you are gaining from that ambling, from that thing where you feel like, maybe, like I'm not going to put that on my resume, but actually you've gained some really interesting hidden skills through, they're just not formally recognized, but there are different kinds of really interesting platforms that are evolving, that are trying to sort of say like, oh, you did that? That means you should be, you may be able to do these things, right? And it's helping us kind of think about how we accrue skills, and that, all that time is not wasted in any way, but we can actually say, no, there's value to what we did here.
Can you list off a couple of those platforms?
Yeah, so you have folks like MZ's SkillsMatch, you have futurefit.ai, you have SkyHive. They're all doing this incredible work of trying to help us as job seekers understand who we are today, right now, with all of those formal and informal skills that we've accumulated over time. And then they're trying to say, and hey, did you know that you're, 60% of the way there towards being a network analyst, or 80% of the way there towards going into human resources. It kind of helps us just sort of envision a few pathways ahead that maybe we never even thought about exploring. And then it helps us see what our gaps are that we need to fill. And then it also connects those gaps to, hundreds or thousands of learning providers that they can go to sort of acquire some of those bits or those competencies or some of those capabilities.
I'm trying to remember the name of the military test that I took in high school that was like, you would be a good, I think it was, I think lawyer. Yes. So that was it. That was it back then. Yeah. So, and I think lawyer, but possibly something not at all aligned. I think those are fun. We should find the most successful people who actually like found their path, and then see what they scored on those kinds of tests initially.
I had like one of those assessments. Yeah. I think I was told to become a nurse.
I think that's great. That's great. I love that kind of like total divergence, but at the same time, I could totally see that. So, this is great. Well, so for folks who are interested in supporting you in your work, and also a lot of this is built on the work that you did with Strata Education Network and the Institute for the Future of Work, which you have a variety of publications people can look at in terms of knowing what's going on right now in the labor force, and what in the future. But I'm curious about, how can folks connect with you? Where is the book available? Are you starting a book club? So many questions.
So the book is available anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Porchlight, Books A Million, all those places, and Wiley. It was published by Wiley. But yes, it was based on work we did at Strata Education Network. It's also based on some of the theories of disruption from Clayton Christensen. So the Institute is featured in there as well. And then they can reach me on LinkedIn, but I also have a website at riseanddesign.io. So they can always just go there.
Okay, and I'm putting, so the Institute for the Future of Work, is it at Strata? Okay.
It's just Strata Institute for the Future of Work. Yep.
Oh, okay, well, I'll redo that. But are you going to read the book? That's my real question.
Oh, you mean like do a recording of me reading the book?
Yeah.
Do you want me to?
Well, I just feel like in COVID, it's got to be super weird to launch a book. And so you have a lot of time to do some of the stuff that perhaps in the past you might not. So if you want, talk to me about like what it's like to launch a book in 2020.
Yeah, no. So originally the book was supposed to come out on Election Day. So it's just kind of, and then, you know, I've told the story to some friends and colleagues, but I had actually turned in the draft for this book a week before COVID really hit the US. And so it's just been kind of like this comedy of errors. And then now everyone's just, you know, consumed with the transition and the insanity that's going on. So yes, it's not the greatest time to launch a book, but it is, what I'm hoping is that, you know, if people really do want to kind of tune out some of the news today, it's meant to be a very positive and bright vision for the future. And that is, I think that's been the thing that's just sort of threaded through all the work that I've done, especially starting with Clayton Christensen's work, is when you're looking at new emerging innovations, there is this tendency to sort of dismiss them and just sort of say, yeah, I don't really need to pay attention to that. It has really nothing to do with what I'm working on over here. But it's precisely at that moment that you have to kind of look at that thing that looks somewhat strange or lower quality to see if there's value there. And that's, you know, where I see a lot of hope in these seeds of innovation. And I hope that really comes across to the readers.
That's great. And I feel like, yes, it might have been awkward to publish to finish writing when you did, but I actually think it would be a fun virtual happy hour activity to come up with worse things to have done a week before COVID, or worse book titles. You know, the end of online learning, the internet is dead. I mean, there's just so many things, or, you know, we're never going to be replaced by robots, or the end of Amazon. There's just a lot of stuff we could come up with that would have been way, way worse. So a book about the future of what learners can do to prepare themselves for the long run, I think is actually pretty well timed. So we are delighted to have you here. And thanks again to our listeners and for the positive comments that we got across all the platforms. And so if you want to follow up with Dr. Weise, Dr. Michelle Weise, first, buy the book. Second, stand by for her Audible version where she will be, you know, whispering in your ear while you go for a run about the future, which is so like, that's exactly what I want when I'm running. I want you in my ear. I also just want to give a shout out that, like, if Room Rater is watching, you are so well set up right now. Like, if Room Rater doesn't find you and say, and like hold this up and say, this is how you set up your room for a virtual interview, I don't know what, I mean, it's very well done. Your backdrop is fantastic. So
thank you.
I don't know if you're in like the lobby of some place, or if it's in your actual home.
You know what? It's like I always record my video conferences from the same angle. So I just decided to sit in my armchair instead of at my desk. And that's all it is it's just a slight tweak. But I'm glad you approve.
Well, the last question is, who sent the flowers to congratulate you for the book?
Oh, my family threw me a little surprise party on Wednesday, nice. And some neighbors came into the backyard and kind of surprised me as well. And we did a little socially distanced gathering. It was a lot of fun. So that's from that.
Oh, that's great. Well, congratulations. It's a huge accomplishment, and it is the right topic for the right time. So thank you for putting it forward. And if there's anything else we can do to be useful, please let me know. But otherwise, folks, please follow up with Michelle Weise, and you can also check out her website, which I am going to check out. What is the website again?
It's riseanddesign.io.
Rise and Design?
Rise and, like A-N-D. Rise and Design.
.io. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see if I got it right. Did I get it right?
Oh no, Rise, not my last name, like Rise, rising.
How did you miss the opportunity to do that? I
That's pretty
mean,
brilliant. So I was going for the R&D. So because I've built so many like research and development labs, I was going for R&D, but this time.
Okay, W&D. But you didn't use your last.
Rise. No, Weise. Rise and design.
Rise and design. Oh, good. Okay, because I was like, how did you not just call it? Call it. Okay, I'm sending people to all these weird websites. I can't wait. This is fun. We're gonna get complaints. You're gonna have to start a hotline. This is fabulous. Well, as always, it's wonderful to spend time with you, and look forward to reading the book. And thank you again for spending time with us today. For those of you who are at home, check it out, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.